Land, especially in South Africa, is a very, very emotional issue. And debates about land are mostly politically loaded and are clouded by emotion. It's therefore important that people who participate in this debate, especially the leaders, must be endowed with exceptional insight. The black people of South Africa believe that South Africa is their country. They are the owners of South Africa, and the whites in South Africa are only being tolerated and they are intruders. The white people, on the other hand, believe that the land that they possess is land that they have legally acquired. Now, these are emotions. We must establish what are the facts. Historically, it is not true that the black people of South Africa are indigenous to South Africa. Yes, they are indigenous to Africa, but not to South Africa. They came from the big lakes area of Central Africa and gradually moved down. The whites, on the other hand, came from the south and they met the black people at the Fish River. Now, let's look at what happened in the Cape. When Jan van Riebeeck put foot on South African soil, he had no intention whatsoever to conquer this land, to take this land as his own. His only ambition and his instruction was to establish a replenishment station on the southern tip of Africa. It was completely unlike the attitude of the Israelites. When they crossed the Jordan River, they had an instruction from God to take over the land, to drive the people that lived in that land away, and to take that land as their very own. In that spirit of Jan van Riebeeck, he immediately started negotiations with the people who lived at the southern tip of Africa. Within 6 years, he concluded an agreement with the Khoisan that the borders between the white settlers and the Khoisan would be the Salt River and the Liesbeek River. Then, within 20 years after his arrival, he concluded an agreement with Captain Schacke that the area between Hout Bay and Saldanha would be handed over to the white settlers as farming land. Thereafter, within 1 month, there was another agreement that the False Bay area would also be handed over to the white settlers. When the need for farmland grew, the settlers moved inland and eventually reached the Fish River. And that was the first moment that the white settlers met with the black people. When the governor of the Cape, Governor van Plattenberg, reached that area, he noticed that there were no black people south of the Keiskamma River. He then, in 1778, concluded an agreement after negotiations with the Xhosa that the Fish River would be the border between the white settlers and the Xhosa people. It is important to note here that there was at that point in time no skirmishes between white and black. There was good relationships, and the attitude of the white settlers was to negotiate for land. In 1835, the great trek into the inland of South Africa started. There were reasons why eventually about 10,000 farmers trekked into the inland of South Africa. The reasons were mainly that after 1806, the British government took control of Southern Africa, and the British government, as a colonial power, did not understand the circumstances of the white farmers in the Eastern Cape. They acted like a colonial power. They did not understand the circumstances, and then they meddled in the internal affairs of the Xhosa people. That created a lot of bitterness amongst the Xhosa people, which eventually resulted in 9 border wars between the white people and the Xhosa people. Circumstances became completely unbearable for the farmers in the Eastern Cape, and they decided on a new venture to trek into the inland of Southern Africa. But there were reasons why they decided to trek into the inland of South Africa. Before 1835, there were a lot of missionaries who went into the inner areas of Southern Africa. Then there were hunters entering Southern Africa into the inland of Southern Africa, and they discovered that the inland of Southern Africa is virtually empty. What were the reasons why these areas were completely depopulated? The reasons were something that happened in the 1820s in Southern Africa. That was the extermination wars between the black people. It is called the Mfekane or the Difakwane, where the black people were in wars between themselves. This resulted in the virtual depopulation of great areas in the inland of Southern Africa. People fled the area or were killed, eventually to the point that they turned to cannibalism. They had to eat their own children. When Andries Pretorius crossed the Orange River, he was surprised to see that there were great areas where people had lived before which were deserted. He encountered black people who were eating their own children. The land was empty. It was virtually a no man's land. When Louis Trichardt trekked into the inland of Southern Africa, the first signs of organized communities was at the Soutpansberge. The area was empty. It was depopulated. When Andries Hendrik Potgieter came to the Oorigstad, the Nelspruit, Lydenburg area, the area was completely empty after the Swazi-Pedi wars. Skeletons of people who had been killed were lying around. It was a no man's land with nobody living there. That was the reason why the trekkers from the Great Trek thought that if they could enter the inland of Southern Africa, they could negotiate with the black kings, the black captains, the chiefs of the blacks, for areas where they could settle and live in peace. It is very important to explain the attitude of the trekkers of the Great Trek. They did not have any aspirations to enter into wars with the internal population of Southern Africa. Piet Retief, before he left, he published his manifesto in the Grahamstown Journal, where he stated explicitly that they wanted to negotiate with the people in the interior of South Africa for areas to settle and to live on. He stated explicitly that they had no intention whatsoever to take the smallest property from anybody whom they would encounter in the inland of South Africa. They were on a peaceful mission with the intention to settle peacefully without interfering with anybody in the inland of South Africa. The question arises, what happened when the trekkers in the Great Trek arrived in Natal? Before they had arrived in Natal, there were already negotiations with the Zulu. The English people who had settled in the Durban area, the Port Natal area, had already concluded an agreement with King Shaka of the Zulus. A person called Farewell treated King Shaka from the Zulus from a wound that he had sustained, and as a reward for his treatment, King Shaka signed an agreement, a treaty with Farewell, that the area around Port Natal, about 50 miles into the interior and 25 miles broad, would be handed over to the Englishmen around the Durban Port Natal area. The text and the script of this treaty does still exist. That was in 1824. And when the trekkers arrived in Natal, they could not speak Zulu. And eventually they made contact with the Englishmen around the Port Natal area, and a person called John Halstead offered to be the interpreter between the trekkers and the Zulu king, at that time already King Dingane. They went there and they wanted to discuss and negotiate with King Dingane for areas to settle on. And you must remember that because of the extermination wars, the area between the Tugela River and the Umzimvubu River, that's a big part of the present-day Natal, was completely depopulated because people had been driven away from that area. They wanted to negotiate with King Dingane to settle there. And when they met King Dingane, he accused them of having stolen his cattle. But fortunately, they had heard that a person called Sikonyela had stolen the cattle, and they had seen about 700 head of cattle, which were King Dingane's cattle. And they agreed that if the trekkers would bring back those 700 cattle, then King Dingane would give them the area between the Tugela River and the Umzimvubu River as a reward for the cattle that had been brought back. This agreement was signed. The original agreement got lost later on, but there was a copy of the agreement which is still in existence and can be shown. There was an agreement that that area would be given to the Voortrekkers to settle on. Unfortunately, later on, when Piet Retief and his men once again came to King Dingane, they were assassinated. 70 people with Piet Retief were assassinated and killed on the Matiwane hill. Thereafter, there were a lot of other agreements. After King Dingane lost the war at the Blood River battle, his successor, his eventual successor, his half-brother Mpande, joined forces with the Voortrekkers and went to war against Dingane and drove him across the Pongola River. And as a reward, there was a very good relationship between the Voortrekkers and King Mpande. Then thereafter, the Voortrekkers noticed that the area between the Klip River and the Buffalo River was virtually empty. And they once again negotiated. They went to the king and negotiated, can we have that area to settle on? Because that land is virtually empty. And that because, of course, because of the extermination wars. The Hlubi people were driven away from that area. And they agreed that that area would be given to the Voortrekkers, once again with an agreement, a written agreement, a treaty, and in exchange for 1,000 riksdollars, that area was given to the Voortrekkers in 1847. When the Voortrekkers negotiated for the Utrecht area, they told King Mpande, but this area is empty, nobody lives here. Can't we agree that that area be given to us to settle on? Eventually they agreed, and in exchange for 100 cattle, they got permission from King Mpande to settle in the Utrecht area. But a while later, the voortrekker said, but we have an agreement from King Mpande, but we have nothing on paper. We've got nothing that is written as proof of our agreement with King Mpande. They went back to him and agreed that in exchange for 300 cattle, they would get an agreement, a written agreement from King Mpande, that they could settle in that area. That treaty, that written agreement is still in existence and can be shown. Thereafter, in 1884, when King Mpande was no longer there, his son Cetshwayo, who became king after King Mpande was no longer there, a person called Sipepu tried to become the king of the Zulus, but he was not the first in line. And he decided to kill all the sons of the king, all the sons of King Cetshwayo. And eventually, a person called Dinizulu, who was actually the rightful person to succeed King Cetshwayo, his uncle decided to hide him so that they do not kill him. And but he was discovered, and he spoke to two farmers from the Port Petersburg area to come and fetch Dinizulu and hide him and keep him until he's grown up. That they did, and then when he was grown up, then they decided to establish a commando consisting out of 100 voortrekkers to go down and enter into a war with Sipepu, who wanted to become the king. They joined forces with an army of the Zulus and eventually won the war against Sipepu. And then they anointed Dinizulu to become the king of the Zulus. By this action, they secured the existence of the Zulu royal house, because Dinizulu was the rightful person to become the king of the Zulus. But in exchange for the voortrekkers having saved the royal house, an area around the present-day Vryheid town was given to the voortrekkers. It was about 1.3 million hectares big, and that area was called the New Republic, the Nuwe Republiek. And that was given to the voortrekkers in exchange for their services to save the royal house of the Zulus. Now we must establish what happened in the present-day Mpumalanga province. When Andries Hendrik Potgieter came into the Lydenburg-Oorigstad area, as I said before, that area was completely empty. It was completely depopulated because of the Swazi-Pedi wars. There was only one person at a lookout point from the Swazi people to see whether the Pedis would come back. That area was completely empty and deserted. That's the reason why Andries Hendrik Potgieter decided to negotiate. And that is like the spirit of negotiation runs like a golden thread through the history, the settlement history of South Africa. Initially, he negotiated with the chief of the Pedi, Sekwati, and agreed with him that they could settle in that area. Then he discovered that during that war, the Swazis had the upper hand, and he immediately went to King Mswati to negotiate with King Mswati. He negotiated with King Mswati about that area and negotiated whether he and his people could settle in that area which was empty in any case. It suited King Mswati to have people settle there because they would act as a buffer between the Pedis and the Swazis. And that's the reason why King Mswati was in agreement with Hendrik Potgieter that they could settle in that area. And eventually an agreement was struck between Hendrik Potgieter and Mswati that in exchange for 100 cattle, that area would be handed over to the Voortrekkers as an area on which they would have permanent land use. Permanent land use. That was in exchange for 100 cattle. One must consider that nowadays it sounds crazy that you could buy such a big area for 100 head of cattle, but at that point in time, cattle were very valuable, especially amongst the black communities. Cattle were very, very special and very, very valuable. And that's the reason why he was prepared to hand over that area for 100 cattle in 1846. Thereafter, in 1855, there was another round of negotiations with King Mswati for the area around the Lebombo Mountains, up until the Portuguese area. The agreement was concluded, and once again, as in the agreements in 1846, a treaty was drafted and signed. These treaties in 1846 and the Treaty of 1855 are still in existence and can be found in the archives in Swaziland. There was an agreement for the Lebombo area for 70 cattle, which would be handed over to King Mswati. But the arrangement with King Mswati in the Lydenburg-Ohrigstad Nelspruit area was so favorable for King Mswati because there was peace between the Swazis and the Pedis, because the Voortrekkers were a buffer between these two tribes, that King Mswati insisted that the area south of the Lydenburg area, the Lydenburg area was an area between the Crocodile River and the Olifants River. King Mswati insisted that the area south of the Crocodile River up until the Pongola River should also be settled by white farmers. That was his insistence, that white farmers should each get a farm to settle upon. But unfortunately, at that point in time, the negotiations were between the ZAR and King Mswati. The arrangement that the Scotchmen would settle that area under the leadership of Alexander McCorkindale was something that satisfied the wishes of King Mswati. Unfortunately, Alexander McCorkindale, after they had settled, was killed of malaria on the Inyaka Island, and the Scotchmen were leaderless, and most of the Scotchmen left the area. What is important here is that the people who settled there did not settle by force. They did not settle because they wanted to have that area. They settled in that area which was originally Swazi area. They settled there because they were asked to settle there, to fulfill the wishes of King Mswati, not the wishes of the Voortrekkers. They settled there because King Mswati had asked them to be there. Thereafter, in 1866, there were another negotiations between the Voortrekkers and King Mswati for the area west of the Lydenburg and the 1860-1855 agreement south of the Crocodile River, to the west of that area, reaching to the borders of the Free State. Once again, they negotiated, and for a number of cattle and, as I have been told, for the exchange of 40 blankets, that area was given to the Voortrekkers. Unfortunately, the agreement was not in writing, so there is no proof of that agreement, but there was an agreement. What is clear here is that the whole present-day Mpumalanga province initially was part of the Swazi kingdom, belonged to the Swazi nation. Now the question arises, if there are areas in Mpumalanga where the white people settled against the agreement, where they settled on areas which were not given to the settlers, whose land is that? Whose land is that? Are these areas land that should be returned to the Swazis as the original and rightful owners of these areas? Or should they be transferred to the present-day ANC government? Who is the rightful owner of that area? From my side, I'm of the opinion that it can only be the first initial owners, that is the Swazi people. If there are areas which were not given to the Voortrekkers, these areas must revert back to the Swazis and their king who agreed with the Voortrekkers on these areas. And the other areas could only be the ownership or people who have the right for eternal land use in that area, the Voortrekkers. It could never be the ANC government, because the ANC government were not party to the deal between the Swazis and the Voortrekkers. That is my view. But what is clear, the whole of Mpumalanga was initially Swazi area. The relationships between the Swazis and the white people of South Africa has always been very, very cordial. There has never been a war between the Swazis and the white people. The white people, as well as the Swazi people, want to preserve that relationship between them as something which is very special. We want to continue with these good relationships. Now the question arises, what happened in the Free State? I explained to you that because of the extermination wars, where black people were at war with one another, the big tribes almost exterminated the smaller tribes. The big tribes like the Zulus under King Shaka went into war with the smaller tribes and drove them away from big areas of South Africa. They left the area. They were killed. And as I explained before, they even turned to cannibalism because there was nothing to eat. When Andries Hendrik Potgieter came into the Free State area, that whole area was virtually empty. Andries Hendrik Potgieter came into contact with the Baralong in that area, and later on with the Bataung under the leadership of Makwana. As I said, that area was completely empty, and Makwana was completely traumatized by the extermination wars, where the leader of the Ndebele, under the leadership of Mzilikazi Silkats, had completely cleared the area. He virtually exterminated that area, and that's the reason why Makwana was completely traumatized and asked the support of Andries Hendrik Potgieter against Mzilikazi and his Ndebeles. They agreed that the area between the Vet and the Vaal River would be given to the Voortrekkers to settle on in exchange for 29 cattle. Once again, it sounds ridiculous that such a big area could be given to the Voortrekkers in exchange for 29 cattle, But cattle were very valuable at that time. And over and above that, that area was empty. Nobody lived there. And the Makwana and the Batuung and the Makwana welcomed Hendrik Potgieter to live there so that he could protect them against Mzilikazi, Silkaats of the Ndebele. That's why the Voortrekkers in increasing numbers settled in that area, because everybody agreed that that area was empty. And in 1836, in battle with the forces of Mzilikazi, Mzilikazi was defeated and fled across the Limpopo River into the present-day Zimbabwe. That area was empty, not only the Free State, but most of the areas north of the present-day Pretoria and Johannesburg, the Limpopo province, was completely empty because of the actions of Mzilikazi. And because the Voortrekkers under the leadership of Hendrik Potgieter had beaten Mzilikazi and his forces, they claimed that area as their own, because as a result of a war that they had won, they had acquired that area as an area on which the Voortrekkers could settle. In 1880, a war broke out between the Koranas under the leadership of David Massou and the Batlaping. And David Massou approached the Voortrekkers to support him in this battle. Eventually, he and the Voortrekkers were victorious, and as a reward, David Massou gave land right documents to the Voortrekkers as a reward for their services for 400 farms, each 3,000 morgen big, to settle upon. Later on, there were further skirmishes between the black tribes there, and once again, the Voortrekkers were rewarded with land to settle upon as a reward for their services as a result of internal squabbles between these tribes. Now we must look at the whole picture. Every time when there was friction between tribes internally in South Africa, in the southern areas of South Africa, the Voortrekkers were requested to support them. Then they were rewarded. Before that, they were rewarded as a result of negotiations that took place. Not in a single incident, the trackers had the attitude, we want to conquer South Africa. We want to exterminate the people who live here and take this land in a land grab style. That was not the intention. That was not the attitude. The Voortrekkers were on a peaceful mission to get land to live on, to call that land their home and their fatherland. Now, what happened in the northern areas of the present-day Limpopo province? When Louis Trichardt came into that area at the Soutpansberge in 1836, he was approached by the chief of the Vendas, Ramabulana. He was at war with his two brothers, the sons of Chief Thoyandou, and they wanted to oust Ramabulana, and Ramabulana asked the services and the support of Louis Trichardt and his men in the war between him and his brothers. Ramabulana eventually, with the support of the Voortrekkers, won the battle, and as a reward for their services, they were given a vast area in that area to settle upon. It is important to note that right through this whole time, The voortrekkers were either negotiating with the chiefs or were requested by the chiefs to support them in internal squabbles. And that must be mentioned quite clearly. In this book in front of me, the settlement history of Southern Africa is being described. A settlement history about the European settlers, the settlement history about the black tribes who moved from the Great Lakes area of South Africa into Southern Africa until they reached the Fish River in the Eastern Cape. This book is written without any political intentions. This book is a historical overview of how did it come about that certain areas in South Africa were settled by black people, certain areas were settled by white people. How did it come about that we have the situation that we have now? The Bushmen were the first nation of South Africa. They were completely displaced by the vanguard of the black people moving south into the Eastern Cape areas. They were exterminated because the black people moved down in bigger groups than the Bushmen. They were better armed, and that's the reason why the Bushmen were not in a position to defend themselves. They were exterminated to the point of near extinction. What we have now is a situation where we've got to deal with what we have now. And this calls for people and leaders endowed with exceptional insight. If you want to order a copy of this booklet, the booklet can be obtained at a very reasonable price at the address that is being shown on the screen. If anybody wants to engage in discussions about the contents of this booklet, I am fully prepared to enter into debates, into discussions, and I can be contacted at the email address which is published within this booklet. I thank you.